I love our new theme song. If you've been with us for a while, you know Definitely Not Batman by Evan Brown. This is Definitely Not Batman Volume 3. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City, and now, definitely beyond, Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hi, Brian.
What do you think? What do you think of the new theme song?
Well, you dropped it unexpectedly on me.
Yes.
So you basically told me to sit down with headphones and listen to the new theme song. I love it. I think I said at the time, I can't imagine how the song could be improved. It's pretty catchy. Mm-hmm. It's well within the theme of the Batman universe and the tone of our show. Yeah. And yet it has become, it's been enhanced with the magic of our friend Evan Brown. So I love it.
Yeah. Let us know what you think of the new song. We've been talking about this for some time, and now we are officially stepping foot into a brand new universe. We are going into season 1 of Doom Patrol. How do you feel about that?
I feel good. I feel excited, and now we're entering the doors of Doom Manor, and we're covering some pretty interesting characters.
Every time we watched an episode, you and I would sit there and say, God, we just need to be talking about this show. There's so much tragedy. There's so much trauma. There are so many moments that make you think. And I can't wait to get into these 15 episodes with a stellar cast, some pretty fantastic writing, and it's just sort of off the wall. Now, we should warn you folks who might have children. Our show leading up to this point has always been pretty family friendly. Doom Patrol is not that. There's a lot of adult language and there is nudity in this pilot episode. So if you haven't seen the episode and you want to watch it, maybe do so without the kids present. But you know, I'm not trying to tell you how to parent your children. You do what you feel. I'm just throwing it out there. This is going to be a different incarnation of the Arkham sessions, and I'm looking forward to diving in.
For folks that have not listened to the show before, maybe this is their entry point, or this is one of the first ones they've listened to. We aren't going to cover scene by scene, line by line. Like, this isn't a review, much like other shows might do for a show like this. This is a particular lens. We use a psychological lens and lift up certain interactions, certain relationships, maybe trends or behavioral patterns we might be seeing, and we talk about them in depth. We talk about them with curiosity, hopefully with a sense of shared interest in what makes these characters tick. Why are they motivated to do the things that they do? Why do they engage in some unexpected behavior? Why do they engage in maladaptive behavior? What is the reasoning potentially behind some of their different patterns and behaviors? And I think that what is exciting for me is that we get to see these characters over the course of each episode. That pretty much in every episode we have another glimpse, if not a deeper dive into each of these individuals and how they interact with each other, such that each of our episodes then will be able to cover a different topic. And we may not get to everything, but I think we'll have plenty to talk about. Yeah,
I mean, we're going from a show that was 22 minutes every episode to a show that is closer to an hour every episode. So I think we're going to have a lot to talk about. And let's get into it.
So Brian, before we jump into the show, there are 2 topics that I hope we get to. One is called the growth mindset, and I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are about that.
Okay.
And the second topic that hopefully will come up is dissociative memory.
Well, that'll definitely come up because we hear it in the show.
We do.
Okay, you're coming in with a list of prepared items.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we can cover these topics.
I mean, I'm sure we can work our way into these topics. I have some things I wanted to talk about as well. First of all, I want to know what you knew about Doom Patrol coming into the series. This isn't a group of heroes that most people have heard of or know about. What did you know about Doom Patrol before you watched this pilot episode?
A very tiny little snippet. Okay. Which is to say only very superficial stuff. Basically, that this is a group of like a ragtag team. They're meant to be oddities. They're meant to be outcasts. And my understanding is that this group of people at the individual level are not necessarily, I want to say, like, they are not good Samaritans. Like, yes. they have typically, they're not heroic. They're not the traditional sense of what a hero is in the sense of like comic books. Yeah. So they're meant to be somewhat flawed. They're not necessarily likable, and they're brought together under some circumstances. That's basically what I knew.
It's funny, when they were created in 1963, this wouldn't have been the first time that comic book characters were flawed characters. Marvel had already been doing it. DC, though, had never really done that. They'd been going, their bread and butter was Superman, Batman, who's certainly flawed, but they were definitive heroes. This was the first time that DC ever really went into super flawed characters who maybe don't even deserve to be heroes, but are thrown into the role of heroes or anti-hero. It was created by Arnold Drake and Bob Haney, artist Bruno Premiani. And it all started in a comic book called My Greatest Adventure number 80. It was basically an anthology series of comics, very much like Detective Comics, and that's the origin of Batman. It's sort of a throw it against the wall, see what sticks. Funny enough, 6 issues later, in number 86, it became known as Doom Patrol. Like, this is what stuck. This is the comic book characters that people decided they wanted to follow. And so the series became known as Doom Patrol. Now, that original incarnation was, of course, the Chief, who we will talk a little bit about in this episode. Negative Man, Larry Trainor, who's also in this incarnation of the group. There's Elastigirl, of course, Rita Farr. There is Robotman, because you can't have Doom Patrol without Robotman, Cliff Steele. And I think that might have been it. Those were the original 4. So interestingly, those are basically our prime 4 in this incarnation of the series. So even though several incarnations of Doom Patrol, similar to Avengers and X-Men and all of these other supergroups, we have managed to still keep those prime 4 members for this TV series, which was created by Jeremy Carver, who a lot of people would know as a writer and showrunner for Supernatural. He was the showrunner for Supernatural before my friend Andrew Dabb. And so I'm very excited to see where this show goes and to experience it with our listeners. Okay, so this first episode, which is actually the second time in the DC universe.
Oh, that's right. We saw. Where did we see? Titans. We saw some of them. Yeah,
there's an episode of Titans, like episode 4 or 5 of Titans, where we are introduced to Doom Patrol. It's what's called a backdoor pilot in the entertainment industry, which is where you want to create a TV series, but you don't really necessarily want to spend the money to create a pilot, test the pilot, decide whether you want to pick it up as a show. So what you do is you write basically your pilot as an episode of another show, where you've got a pre-established group of fans who are watching, and based on those reactions, you decide if you want to to carry it over into a series. And we did notice that there was a change. The majority of the cast was still the same. You still had Brendan Fraser as Robotman. You still had Matt Bomer as the voice of Negative Man. You still had April Bowlby as Rita Farr. But in this new version, we have Timothy Dalton, formerly James Bond, playing the role of the chief.
The poor man's...
Be very careful about what you're about to say here.
Well, I was going to say the poor man's Professor X, and that's probably not true, but...
Okay, I see where you're going with this. The wheelchair-bound
very
scientist...
Wise. He's sort of fatherly. He takes them in to Doom Manor.
But then also does things...
He protects them, tells them don't go out into the world.
Although he does experiment on them and do things to them that, aren't necessarily... they're not consenting to it. Like, Robotman didn't consent to being brought back to life, essentially. So, yeah, he's just like Professor X. Really, and...
What non-consensual healing treatments.
Yeah, this is like DC's way of being like, hey, you know what's wrong with Professor X? We should just create an entire character where it's just right there in the open. Let's talk about that. Well, for starters, that this show is going to go places when we open up and you're dealing with a former Nazi scientist who is giving someone I love dearly, Alan Tudyk, and a supernatural ability of some kind. He goes into a machine, is clearly paying a fortune, and he is split apart into different pieces, almost like a sort of an energy jigsaw puzzle, for lack of a better word. We don't know much about this character, except that we know that he's the narrator of the show.
Yeah.
We think he's probably the villain based on the fact that he's hunting down Nazis and using them for their expertise and their help. But also because he's got a little bit, by the time we see him again at the end of the show, at the end of this pilot, he seems to be a bit mischievous, a bit dastardly. And he clearly knows the chief.
Well, when you say hunting down Nazis, you don't mean persecuting them. You mean
he's tracking them down,
securing their work in order to. What I really like about the beginning of the episode is this lays the foundation for something just incredibly fascinating. It just poses the question: what are you willing to do to stretch the limits of your mind? What are you willing to do to access these supernatural abilities? And that's one of the very first things we see. His entire body is essentially destroyed and fragmented, but the idea is that he transcends his physical vessel, that he becomes this, he has this bigger presence and this kind of new set of capabilities that empower him to do certain things. And I think the beginning of the episode lays down the foundation of this idea that the mind is the limit. I mean, that those words were stated very clearly. It is.
Oh, I have audio of this chant. Let's take a listen.
I'm creeped out by it, just for the record.
All right. Well, let's see if the listeners are creeped out.
Are you ready, Mr. Morden?
Ready!
Repeat after me, please. The mind is the limit. Again.
The mind is the limit.
Again.
The mind is the limit. 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 The mind is the limit.
Which is to imply then, in addition to being kind of scary in this moment, but implying that the reason we are the reason that we are limited The reason that we can only do so much is due to our mind's capacity, our ability to imagine, to fantasize, to dream, whatever that may be. And with just a little nudge from whatever experimentation, supernatural power, there is now the opportunity to expand our actual, if not completely eliminate the limits, because of the way that we use our brain, because of the way that we think.
Yeah. Well, we don't get to learn very much about this character. I mean, I'll fill folks in. This is Eric Morden. We will learn a lot more about him and his story, but needless to say, he has a history with the chief, and he becomes Mr. Nobody at the beginning of this episode, and we see more of him as the episode progresses. Let's talk about the characters we do spend a significant amount of time with. This is a show where it's almost like in the pilot, they are setting up every bit of what we need to know about the majority of the principal cast. We really get the most interaction with Robotman, who, of course, is Cliff Steele. He is a race car driver who maybe
he's a D.
He is a D. It's possible that fame has maybe it's given him a little bit more than maybe he deserves. He is a womanizer. He is having an affair with the nanny while A, the kid is not being watched, and B, the wife is right there in the house. He has a very bad relationship with his wife, who clearly knows all this is going on. And we are led to believe that during a race, he is in a Days of Thunder-esque accident that potentially puts him in the hospital, at the very least renders him unconscious. And basically the next time we see him, it is through his POV as we're watching the chief rebuild him. Like Bionic Man style. And so we are led to believe that accident essentially killed him.
Yeah.
We find out that his brain is the only part of his body that was salvageable, which leads one to wonder what has become of him. And up to this point, we still haven't seen him. It's not until another one of the metahumans in the house, Rita Farr, basically sits with him and lays it all out there. We see that the chief is trying to do it slowly. He's trying to introduce the idea of, you are not Cliff Steele anymore. You're not who you thought you've always been.
I appreciate the use of gradual, essentially he's doing some physical therapy techniques. He's using psychological therapy. He's sort of combining trauma-informed approaches with, kind of in conjunction with the recovery process. And I say recovery process, but it's almost as if he has to learn for the first time how to utilize his robot arms and legs and everything from his ability to formulate words to his ability to walk. He has to relearn everything with this new body. And this becomes, certainly we're not there yet.
And we should say he's Frankenstein. Like it is a robot.
I mean,
it is
he
a
couldn't
fully...
have chosen, so the chief couldn't have chosen a more disturbing robot vessel. Like it's not
shiny and clean.
No.
It is the most rusted. You know what's interesting too is he has articulated eyelids, but cannot move his mouth. Like it is a conscious choice by the chief to create eyelids that can open and close in order to show emotion in the character. But I found that to be...
Well, do you really need... So let's really break it down.
Yeah.
He can't enjoy food. He can't eat. He can't feel any bodily sensations. It is... as if he's detached in terms of his sensory abilities with his body.
He has the emotions, but does not have the physical feelings of, we see that he basically, well, I've got audio of this too. Let's take a listen.
I can't feel pain. No matter how hard I hit, where I hit, what I hit, I can't feel pain. That's mighty shitty of you, Doc.
So not only can he not feel aroused in a good sense, he also cannot feel the physical pain that sometimes we need to mitigate some of the emotional feelings. Like we do need that sense of physical comfort, even if it's painful, to try and regulate some of the feelings we have. So without that, the only ability he has is his emotional regulation in and of itself, which is incredibly challenging.
Let's talk about what led to that moment, though, because it's not the realization that he is a robot man. It is the realization that the car crash on the racetrack didn't kill him. What actually did, he got away from that scot-free, won the race, was still a horrible human being, and then he decided he wanted to be better. Let's take a listen to this phone message that he has left for his estranged at this point wife, and we will really get a sense of where he is in his life here. Let's take a listen.
I don't know what happened to us. I'm gonna be better. I know it's late.
Hello?
Hey. Hi. I don't know if you even care how sorry I am.
Go on.
After the phone message, he picks up his wife and his daughter, who he seems to love more than anything in the world. And we find out that he was in a car accident that night, and his wife died and his child died. That's what we're told. Mm-hmm. That's what he's told.
Right.
And that's what leads him to start punching water heaters and, whatever. He can't experience pain. One thing that I was thinking about, and we've discussed it a little bit, especially toward the beginning of our podcast, when we started a few years back. I want to talk a little bit about your personal history in treating vets in the VA, people who have lost limbs, people who have basically been put back together by teams of doctors and surgeons, and the things that you experienced through them. Give us a little bit of that background. And let's talk about some of the folks who may have been feeling the same sorts of things that Cliff Steele was feeling while laid up on the chief's, medical bed.
When you experience something as significant as an amputation or serious injury, traumatic brain injury, certainly it's important not just for the physical therapy to be a part of your recovery, but also mental health therapy, testing, evaluation. We did a whole battery of tests for all of our patients following, in my role, it was following major surgery. So what I would do is I would come in usually a day or two after the surgery is completed, and the unit or the particular the unit that I was assigned to was for soldiers or returning service members who had some serious injury or experienced an accident after their deployment. So to be more clear, they'd undergone surgery and it may have been related to some accident or some incident that occurred while they were deployed. Or in many cases, actually, it is some kind of accident or needed surgery that happened after they've returned and integrated following deployment.
Oh, wow.
but
So they
became
were
very
survivors of whatever deployment they had,
Yes.
and they came back only to
Yes.
lose a limb or have a major trauma.
And that's important because clearly I was not on site overseas handling some of the injuries right after combat. But typically the people that I was assessing and providing therapy for had already experienced some kind of incident while they were serving, and then unfortunately had to undergo some major surgery, or like I said, in many cases had some kind of accident or additional physical trauma. And what we would do is provide a full cognitive test to kind of check in with their memory, their executive functioning, their ability to repeat words, their ability to recall anything from last week, yesterday, 5 minutes ago, to the word I just said. So
this isn't so different than what we're seeing the chief putting him through, where he's showing little signs with a word and he's saying like bird,
yes,
bird. And then that's when Cliff sees that it's 1995, years after his accident. And we learn that he can say more than just bird. So those sorts of cognitive tests are the kinds of things that you would be putting them through to see what they, and you mentioned memory. Well, this seems like a great opportunity to talk a little bit about the chief. I've got the audio here where he explains why Cliff's memories are so fragmented.
I can't hold a memory. Everything's fractured. Everything's bad.
You're experiencing something called dissociative memory. It'll all come back, the bad and the good. We'll get you on your feet. You'll start feeling like yourself soon enough.
Yeah, so it's often called dissociative amnesia, which is a real condition. There are a couple of disorders associated with dissociative amnesia. Essentially, it's this condition where a person has disruptions in their memory, so basically memory loss or breakdowns of memory, in addition to kind of perception problems, awareness problems, identity, so like forgetting who you are for fleeting moments. Interestingly, there are a couple of types of this. So a localized memory loss may be due to maybe like one or two memories, like childhood memories that somebody has lost completely related to usually a traumatic event, or generalized memory loss, which is a whole chunk of like years and years, a span of a person's life even, or the inability to recognize a circle of friends, family members, what job they had. And interestingly, dissociative amnesia, even though it's rare, it's like 1 to 2% of the population, it typically is associated with some kind of event. It's been linked to a couple things. One is overwhelming stress, and I would consider that like a traumatic event, something
So it's like the brain has shut down.
Yeah, it's like you're exposed to such horrific things during war or combat, particular accident that you may have been in. This is kind of where Cliff falls into. An accident that may have been so horrific and unbelievably traumatizing for him, something he cannot grapple with. His brain almost like a tape. I'm showing you with my hands, no one can see, but the cassette tape, like remember how we used to like cut? Yeah. So it's almost like you cut a piece of that out and link or glue the two pieces together. I'm sure there's some editing analogy for this, but that sense that whole memory has been cut out or wiped away because it was just too difficult to internalize, too difficult to process. It was essentially too threatening to the mind. So psychologically, we might erase it from our memory in order to just sort of move forward and function. Typically, this is temporary, that at times the memory may come back. It may return in sort of flashbacks or small lapses, or the entire memory may return. But it's definitely something that can be extremely disturbing, because you suddenly have access to a memory that you've forgotten. And it's important to, what I appreciate about Cliff's situation is that as his memory comes back to him, he has people around him that can just calm him down and be supportive of him, because what he learns is not only tragic, but it shifts the way in that he's thinking about his new self.
Yeah.
He used to think, well, okay, so now I'm this like horrific robot monster thing, but as long as my wife and kid have moved on, at least they've found some future. I'm sad to not be
I
a
was
parent.
horrible in their life.
Yeah.
So now that they have moved on without me, I feel good knowing that.
Yeah.
Until he realizes,
No, he is the cause. In learning that he is the cause of their deaths, he ultimately takes on an incredible heaviness of self-blame, low self-esteem, and a sense of hopelessness. Like I truly was worried about whether he would even find any motivation to move forward as Robotman.
I want to ask a little bit about bedside manner, because Rita, when we meet her, and she just straight up shows him that he is not the man that he once knew. In fact, he's not a man at all. He is a brain inside a rusted metal body. When she shows him that, the chief comes in and basically says he wasn't ready. And I've been trying to do this slowly. And she sort of says, no, sometimes you've got to just rip the bandage off. Talk a little bit about the bedside manner of the two. Was one right over the other? Was one a way that you thought you would have gone in that, or is it maybe a combination of
Doesn't she take the mirror and like force it in front of him?
Yeah,
She's
she
like,
just puts it right in front of him.
This is what you look like.
Yeah.
And going back to our conversation about the VA, I was incredibly anxious because, this was, what year are we? This was about 8 years ago. And so I remember knocking on these hospital doors and sort of attempting to approach patients who had just undergone major surgeries. Some had lost limbs. My assessment was complex. It was not only, as I mentioned, doing these cognitive tests to see how their relative functioning is, to see how they did following the surgery in terms of memory, attention, concentration, things like that, but also in terms of their emotional well-being. Do they have motivation to move on? Are they feeling hopeful about their recovery? Do they have support in their lives to help them through the next steps? And I remember in my assessment asking about suicide, and I'll never forget one of the first times I encountered this, and felt so nervous approaching a patient who was in a motorcycle accident. So I'd already incurred injury during deployment, returned, and was in a motorcycle accident, and his leg had to be amputated. And he had other injuries, pretty serious injuries to his body, his arms, his other leg. And I just recall feeling nervous to ask him about what was motivating him, what sort of life promotion did he have, how could he, what did he think about the next steps? And he was definitely on to me in the sense that he's like, I know why you're here. you're going to ask me if I'm going to kill myself when I get home. You're going to ask me whether I care about my new life. And he was very blunt. He was just very straightforward. And it was clear to me that this was not the first time that he was interacting with a VA mental health provider or professional, that he had been through all the different kinds of medical and mental health examinations and evaluations. And I just felt so, at least in the beginning, sort of helpless around the idea that I did not know how I would be anything for him.
He knew your next steps before you did.
He did. And he sort of I think he wanted to just, I don't know, like shortcut it. What am I trying to say? Like just interrupt the process and just say like, look, here's
Wanted
the
to
situation.
truncate everything,
Yes.
jump right to the end and say, here's the deal. Here's what I'm feeling. Here's where I'm
Yeah,
going.
I know why you're here. And
How did that work out?
I persisted because I felt as though, even though he was, it's interesting because it's not that he wasn't cooperative. He was simply so straightforward and blunt with me that I wasn't really able to start processing some of the complexities of his recovery and sort of really examining him from the mental health aspect. So it did require some willingness on his end. But I do remember having a couple of visits with him, and it's so funny because it's not funny. It makes me laugh now because I would sort of like lightly knock on the door, and if he wasn't there, he would be undergoing his physical therapy or just not in his room. I would get this sense of relief, like, okay, I don't have to like figure this out today.
It's interesting though, and I think it's for listeners who are not psychologists and therapists and physical therapists and whatever. Like, you don't think about it. You always think, well, we're going to go the pace of the patient. We're going to go the pace of that person and introduce whatever needs to be introduced at a slow speed. Or in this case, he was like, got it. I know what you're here for. Here's the thing. And he just wanted to go through it. But what you really needed to do was slow it down for the therapist's need. Like, you needed to process all of these things.
Right.
So it's much more of a symbiotic relationship, therapist-patient. You need the time to process as much as the patient needed time to process, because they were like through it.
Yeah. And luckily over the course, and I now realize how I now have gratitude for the experience, because these are patients that, because of their situation, I could make several attempts. I remember going to the hospital multiple times during a single day just to kind of check in and see if somebody was willing to speak with me. If that wasn't the best time, I could come back an hour later. There was a sense of, at least on my end, gratitude for my ability to practice perseverance and to, so if one way didn't quite work, I'll try another way. And with this patient in particular, he did open up to me, and we did eventually talk about who could take care of him and what that meant for him as a person who will never be the same. His body will never be the same. And how does that change his sense of self and his sense of efficacy?
Right.
And certainly, like a lot of people, and to be clear, I didn't serve, but for a lot of people who have served, there is an incredible amount of value and confidence and sense of pride in being able to serve our country. And so to have that be associated with failure or injury or just a disruption of the sense of your whole self, there's a lot of mental health recovery that is usually necessary after things like this. So I'm just incredibly grateful for the opportunity to be able to have this practice, to be able to have this particular rotation. And your comments about bedside manner are important. I could have easily said, "You're good? Okay. Like, I'm done here."
Yeah.
I could have been frank back. I could have been certain ways. And I think actually to be patient and compassionate and be curious, and then like poor man's Professor X here, to actually try to set the pace and to be confident in my knowing that something like this takes time.
Yeah.
It takes particular techniques. I appreciated that that Niles had these techniques that he was using to help Cliff along with his recovery. I didn't like what Rita did. I thought it was kind of abrupt, and I don't know. I would never have done something like that. But it makes for an interesting dynamic for the two of them. And interestingly, she is all about external beauty. She's all about what we look like on the outside.
I think that's why
That's
all
why she did
happened.
it.
Yeah. And she is also a traumatized, she's a victim.
Let me share some of the trauma with you, because I need you to understand what this truly is about. I'm tired of waiting for you to be in the trauma with me.
You need to get over it, because you're not the only one who's had to get over something. Take it from me. I too.
I would argue that I don't think she wants him to get over it. I think she wants him to be in the trauma like she is. Like, I think she wants him to join her in whatever sort of turmoil and
let's talk about her
emotional pain that she's in.
turmoil. She's Rita Farr. She is a classic movie starlet who fell into a body of water, like a lake, and came out. She ingested some sort of light, something or other. We don't know exactly what. When she came out, she basically was melting. She was sludgy and a horrific figure to everyone on the set, which is the antithesis of what she wanted. She always took great pride in her beauty.
Yeah.
She was a starlet. That was her bread and butter. Was I am a beautiful actress who may or may not have been good at what she did.
Well, and that is in parallel. Like, so far, the things that happen to people or the ways in which they're disfigured, or the way in which they transition, have a lot to do with the faults or the weaknesses that they had. So with Cliff, he was all about arousal. He was all about risk taking. He was all about what we talked about on the show many times before, just kind of getting that selfish, euphoric experience at the cost of other people's needs. And now he's unable to feel his junk. Like, he has no ability to like experience those things.
Yeah.
At least from the physical sense at this time. And then Rita, like you're saying, is completely transformed. She's kind of a blob. Like, she really is the blob.
Literally a blob. She is barely being held together. And it seems that stress and even her metabolism, because she has to constantly eat in order to maintain her shape, literally her shape. Like, she is the shape of a woman, unless things start to droop and sag and she begins to melt. I mean, her for lack of a better word, super heroine name is Elasti-Woman, because she is essentially, maybe we'll see her come to grips with that, but and figure out how to use that to her advantage, because I imagine it will be something that she is able to use to her advantage, but for now, she's just trying to keep herself together. And we see that she doesn't. Later, when they go out on a field trip, basically into town, before the doctor thinks they're ready, she loses it and basically destroys the town as this blob-like substance of skin. And something that I thought was just completely sad is when Cliff decides to go and stop her. He gets in front of her and holds up a piece of the sidewalk or the road, in order to stop her forward momentum. And we see her face in the sludge. And I've got the audio here. Let's take a listen.
I want to go home.
We can do that.
It's as if this manifestation, this big blob, is the accumulation of her shame and her what she considers ugliness. It's almost like, I don't know. I related to this in a weird way. Like, look, I'm going to talk about gender for a moment here. A lot of times, women feel like they have to hold it together, that we have to be, we have to appear a certain way. Our hair has to be perfect. Our makeup has to be perfect. Our physical bodies have to be a certain way. Mm-hmm. You just said she's shaped like a woman. Like, we all know what that means. There are curves expected, but then there's thinness expected. And then there's a certain posture expected. There's a lot of perfection around, typically what it's like to be presenting female. And this sense of the moment she cannot withstand those expectations, the moment that it's almost as if psychologically she is unable to fulfill those extremely high expectations, she lets herself go, meaning her body gives up the facade and she sort of melts into this blobby, giant blobby mound of doughy stuff with a face. Like, there's a face in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think there's a sense that that is that sounds weird, but it's my sense that that's her true form. Like that blobby.
Oh, absolutely.
Blob
now,
is her true form. Now, that's what she is. And so,
and it expands too. It's beyond just the mass of her as a woman. Like, she becomes basically half the size of this town. And I thought that was interesting. We should talk a little bit about her personality, both before and after. She still revels in seeing herself on screen. We see several times over the course of this episode where the group is watching one of her old movies. Mm-hmm. And she goes into town and she speaks to a waitress at a diner who talks about having grown up on her movies. And she's not interested in hearing the waitress talk about the experience that she had with her father watching these movies. She's more interested in hearing what she thought about Rita's movies.
Yeah.
So she's very much, there's a lot of self-absorbed behavior in there. It's the longing for what her life used to be, and maybe even pining for what it could have been had this accident not.
Well, and say what you will about her attitude and the way that she treated other people, which certainly was ugly. Mm-hmm. She was a good actor. She was actually quite good. She was.
Well, they put her. Mr. Nobody puts her in between the likes of Deborah Kerr and Yvette Vickers.
I don't know who those people are.
So Deborah Kerr was an actress who was quite good. In fact, if you've ever seen the film version of The King and I with Yul Brynner, she played Anna. She was the lead. Like, she had she started with Cary Grant in an Affair to Remember. So she's got some iconic films under her belt. Yvette Vickers also has a couple of iconic films under her belt, but not necessarily of the same caliber. She was in a lot of movies that might start with the title or the words Attack of the.
Okay.
So Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Or Attack of the Giant Leeches. Like she was an actress of that caliber. But even when we're talking about Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, she was not the 50-Foot Woman. Like she was, that's a film all about a woman who discovers that her husband is cheating on her. And because of this sort of, I don't want to spoil too much, because of this interaction that she has with extraterrestrial beings, she is turned into a 50-foot woman and decides to take revenge on everyone in town, including her husband and her husband's new floozy. The floozy being played by Yvette Vickers. So she wasn't even the 50-foot woman. She was the other woman. So Mr. Nobody puts her in between those two people.
Okay.
So there's a very wide
he meant
gap.
to say there is a lot of the spectrum is huge.
Yes, she may have made some quality material, but she also probably made some really horrible material.
Well, and the person she interacts with in the cafe in town was just marveling at how much she looked like this actor.
And sounded, yeah.
And talked about the meaning of watching these films with her father. And there was a sense that, again, I do feel like Rita understood that she had value, that she meant something to people by being in these pictures.
Yeah.
And yet it's a fleeting sentiment because she knows that she can't be that anymore.
Right.
In the same way, we see Cliff watching like VHS tapes, I think, of race car competitions.
Well, yeah.
Like NASCAR style races.
Well, and he figures out his sort of outlet for coping is to build a gigantic model for his remote control cars. Like it's basically a giant track for his cars. Like he still lives for that. And you could see, even though you can't see the emotion, there's almost this comfort that comes over him as he's sitting there watching these little cars go around the track. And it took him, 10 years to build the entire model of town. With
I was
the
so
mountains
worried that Jane would destroy the entire thing.
Well,
I don't know if I think that tension was intentional.
Yes.
But
we'll talk
you're right.
about Jane. Maybe not in this episode.
There's simply no time. But I did notice that each of the characters had something. You're right. There was some kind of hobby or something in their lives that brought them a sense of pleasure and focus. And so for him, it was the model cars. For
Rita.
For Rita, it is knitting.
Yeah.
And I feel like knitting also kind of keeps her body busy and
it's all about putting something together. Like it's all about weaving these threads into something that will take shape. It'll have a shape when she's done with it.
And for Negative Man, it's the horticulture.
Yeah. Let's talk about Negative Man a little bit. We don't get to know as much about him. Obviously, this is a TV series, so we're going to learn more about all these people as we move forward. But Negative Man, we learn, is a former test pilot. He was shortlisted for the Mercury 7 astronauts, the very first astronauts for America. And he's very much modeled after like a Chuck Yeager type, the man who...
I don't know who that is. Wow. Around what year is that?
Wow. I took you to the Air and Space Museum in DC and
remember.
Everything. Chuck Yeager. Well, okay. So Chuck Yeager is the man who broke the sound barrier. There was a period of time where people didn't believe you could go Mach 1. You could not go beyond the speed of
Could
sound.
not surpass the
Yes.
the speed of sound.
And he did. After many people tried and died, Chuck got up into the Bell X1, Glorious Glennis, and he broke the sound barrier. By the way, with a couple of broken ribs from having fallen off a horse a couple days earlier. He didn't tell anyone except for his wife and for and his good friend, and they figured out a way to get him to, like, he couldn't even seal the cockpit door because he was in such pain. So they broke off the handle of a mop, and he used that for leverage to seal the cockpit door. And then he went and broke the sound barrier. This is the kind of people who existed.
So this brings me to something that I have noted, we've talked about before. There's a certain type of personality willing to be a test pilot. There seems to be a fair amount of intelligence and problem-solving skills and just quick thinking, hand-eye coordination. There's a lot of stuff that you need, but there's also a level of risk-taking.
Yes,
there's a high level of willingness to even sacrifice yourself.
Absolutely, and not even necessarily for the sake of the science. I mean, yes, he was sacrificing himself both physically and mentally for the further knowledge of what it would take to, create the perfect rocket engine or, whatever. But you're talking about, he broke the sound barrier in 1947. You're talking about a time where you're just like, is this even possible? Well, let's just keep trying. And he was, after seeing his friends die, he was willing to get into an airplane that was being dropped from another plane and, just push it. Like, you can feel the plane coming apart, and then suddenly he breaks through the sound barrier and everything's smooth, and you realize, oh, this is possible. So then pilots, including Chuck didn't retire after that. He kept, every time someone else would go a little bit faster, Chuck would then go up into a plane and go faster. Whenever somebody would go higher, Chuck would go higher. The X-15 plane that we see Larry Trainer get into in this episode was a real plane designed to experiment with going faster and going higher. It was how can we set records for speed? How can we set records for altitude? And so Larry was modeled off of characters like Chuck Yeager. And then a horrible accident as he was right there at the edge of the Earth and space. He too was sort of consumed by some sort of cosmic something or other. And his plane crashed, and he came out of it a horribly disfigured, burned man, not unlike Chuck. If you've ever seen The Right Stuff, so much of this is like based on Chuck. It makes you wonder if Chuck Yeager has some sort of space entity inside of him. But he walked out a burned man, and is now living. He basically is bandaged up. He looks like the Invisible Man from the old Universal pictures. That's who he reminds me of, because he's completely bandaged up. And I'm mostly, or I should say, he is the one of the bunch who fascinates me the most, because he just sort of the idea that there is this entity that's inside of him. I have questions about how much he is controlled by it, what is left of his personhood in terms, not just physically. I imagine he has this charred body and that's it. And that this other being animates his body and he can control it. And yet Larry, his mind is there. Yeah. So I'm interested to learn more about that. The one aspect that we do learn about is shared with us, or sort of unfolds, when
they all go to the city, or they all go into town, and he decides he's reluctant to go with the group, but he decides that he'll go into a bar and just like what I would imagine a normal dude would do. He just wants to go up to the bar and have a beer and be a townie. He just wants to blend in. He also knows that he looks like a freak. He has these bandages covering his whole body.
But he wants to feel normal.
He does.
For a minute.
So he has a willingness to stand out and still experience some normalcy. He orders a beer. The bartender is actually quite nice and serves him a beer.
Is a bit shocked by his appearance, but is like, well, okay, what do you
there's
have?
certainly no threat inside this bar. But we learn a little bit about how Larry feels about himself.
Larry knew they were staring at him, and yes, it bothered him, but not for reasons one might think. The truth is, Larry Traynor had felt like a monster long before he ever was one.
We got a good light here, Larry.
Hold on, there's something up here.
Larry, do you read? Larry, come in.
And the sadder truth was, he'd finally become what he had once felt like only inside.
No.
So what you heard, I'm realizing there's no audio for the particular part of the clip that's important, which is that Larry has a lover. He has somebody who is another. I don't think it's a pilot. I think he's someone on this crew who he is seen making out with, like between tests.
And when you say partner on the crew, it's another man.
Yes.
Like, yeah. I mean, yes.
Yeah. So I can imagine in the early 60s that being gay was incredibly stigmatized, and it's only something you could really express in secrecy. And he internalized the sense of being seen, or at least being considered defective or immoral, or somehow flawed in terms of his orientation. We are beginning to understand, and you mentioned he's married, he has a wife, he has a child, he's living the straight life, and has a relationship on the side with this man. I think it gives us a sense of where he was at psychologically at the moment that he had this accident. I just think that there's a lot more to uncover.
Yeah.
With him.
It's another one of those characters that I'm glad that there are 14 more episodes to uncover, not just Under the Bandages, but yeah. Andrea, I feel like we've covered a lot so far, and really we've only talked about Robotman, we've talked about Rita, Elastigirl / Elasti-Woman, whichever incarnation she is in the series, and we've talked about Negative Man a little bit.
So earlier, we actually started talking about the growth mindset when we were examining the beginning of the episode with Mr. Nobody. This concept that one of our limitations is the mind itself.
Okay.
And I think that this first episode is a really nice depiction of this concept of the growth mindset. This is a concept that has a lot to do with resilience. Essentially, this is the growth mindset is in opposition to the concept of a fixed mindset. So a fixed mindset assumes that things are locked in. Our character, our IQ, our creativity, that these abilities are basically static. They're fixed. We cannot change them in any meaningful way as we age and develop. And this is important. That particular theory is important because when we think about success, we then are locked into ideas that my success, for instance, is essentially going to be a product of my current level of inherent intelligence. It's going to be based on the abilities and generally the skills that I have now. And that is, of course, that can be limiting.
Right.
That can, for some of us, come across as sort of unexciting, if not disappointing. A growth mindset, on the other hand, and by the way, the psychologist up at Stanford who theorized the growth mindset is Carol Dweck, and her book called Mindset: The New Psychology of Success is one that I highly recommend. So Dr. Dweck established this idea that the growth mindset, on the other hand, thrives on this concept of challenge, that rather than being disappointed by failure and stopping there, we see failure as a springboard, as something that launches us into growth and problem solving and actually stretches our existing abilities. This is a theory that makes me feel excited because I can thrive. It means that I can make mistakes and fail, and what I get out of failing is the ability to grow from it. I actually gain more sort of like brain currency from making mistakes.
Gotcha.
So one of the things to consider then is how this applies to these characters. And I think that Robotman, for instance, as we follow him, is demonstrating this concept of a growth mindset. What's interesting about the growth mindset is that you kind of have to believe, it's sort of a meta theory. You have to believe in the growth mindset as a concept in order to even like progress in that direction.
Sure.
I want to read a quote by Dr. Dweck. She says, for many years, her research shows that the view you adopt for yourself profoundly affects the way that you lead your life. It can determine whether you become the person you want to be and whether you accomplish the things you value. How does this happen? How can a simple belief have the power to transform your psychology and as a result, your life? And she goes on to say, the growth mindset is based on the belief that your basic qualities are things you can cultivate through your efforts. Although people may differ in every which way in their initial talents and aptitudes, interests, or temperaments, everyone can change and grow through application and experience. And this is the heart of the growth mindset. This concept that you must have, first of all, conviction that human qualities like intelligence and creativity can be cultivated and can adapt and develop. When you think about what that means that we know we have sort of this equitable idea about each other. We no longer simply think that certain people have high IQ and will always have high IQ. Certain people have low IQ and will always have low IQ. There's a sense of more flexibility around how we see ourselves and each other. And this is important when we think about how Robotman finds the strength to climb stairs. There's this really moving scene where he's just grunting and hitting the base of the stairs, and he's seemingly there for hours. He's just trying to literally walk up like 3 stairs.
Right.
And
the other members of the team are basically his physical therapists at this point.
Yeah, he's getting some encouragement from them. The support that he has, I think, is like a pretty significant for them to be encouraging him. But it's not until he begins to fabricate some images, some sort of illusions of his daughter. He begins to kind of piece together memories of his daughter when when she was small, and they would walk up the stairs at their house. And he creates this interaction, this fantasy essentially in his mind, which is very hard to do given that all that he has is his brain,
Right.
and he has yet to really fully achieve all functioning of his brain
Right.
in this existing robot body. And he's able to manifest this image and this interaction of her and hear her voice and see her. And he manages to get his body up and lift his legs, much like we see among real people who are managing first-time use of their prosthetic limbs. And we see him succeed through this emotional motivation, and in combination with his physical strength, he surpasses his pre-existing idea of what his abilities are.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a really good example of how his experiences, learning of the trauma, understanding what his new physical sense, his physical body is, and now having to overcome new barriers, he's able to work through that and sort of surpass his pre-existing limits. He really pushes the limits. And I think that sets the theme for what we're seeing with some of these other characters, that we're understanding and learning how they are transcending sort of these fixed ideas.
Right.
So you can only be pretty if you look a certain way, or you can only be seen as human if you're straight, or if you have this particular orientation. We're going to begin learning that those are not necessarily true. So as Dr. Dweck asserts, in that fixed mindset, the process is this sort of like recurring internal monologue of constant self-judging and evaluation. And that's not really good for us. The growth mindset, on the other hand, has a very different internal monologue. It's one that has what she considers like a voracious appetite for learning. It's constantly seeking out input and information that's going to help us digest and metabolize and construct and build our sense of self and our abilities. And this theory, I think, is really applicable to what we're seeing with this character development.
Cool. Do you think we'll see more of it going forward? Like, is that something that you can chart?
I think so. I think we're going to start to see some of the, certainly some of the characters' limitations and why they have those limitations. And I think that's going to continue to unfold through the next couple of episodes. But we are starting to see some significant changes as far as their sense of self and their projection, their ability to sense who they will become.
Right. So what do you think of this first episode? Do you think we're going to have enough to talk about over the next 14 episodes?
There's a ton here. I think even with this first episode, we could probably talk for another... we didn't even talk about the jackass that comes in later. That's an animal.
Well, there are things I think we can talk about as they become a little bit more important to the series. I promise you'll be able to talk about the jackass.
I'm referring to the animal, not any particular human person.
By the way, folks, if you have not seen this, or you're looking for a way to see it, it's available on Blu-ray, it's available on DVD, and it's available to stream over at the DC Universe app or online at DCUniverse.com. You should absolutely check this out. We hope you follow along with us. It's an entertaining show. Despite all of the trauma and the deep feelings and topics that we're going to be talking about, and it goes to places you would never in a million years imagine a show like this would go. So I'm very much looking forward to covering the rest of the series with you, Drea. And since we're talking about the DC Universe app, over the last couple of days, for whatever reason, I decided to binge Titans. I know that we gave it a couple of episodes.
It gets better, right?
When it first started to air, and we kind of abandoned it. It's a show that really does get better, especially in the second season, where they are dealing less with Raven and her sort of personal problems. I thought the first season's villain was a little... it's kind of what you would expect from a show with a bunch of characters with sort of meta superpowers. The second season brings it down to a much more grounded level. Human villains, human emotions, lots of exploring their own inner feelings. Dick being haunted by Bruce Wayne, both physically and mentally.
I like me some Bruce Wayne hauntings.
Well, you would love these Bruce Wayne hauntings. I'm certainly not being paid to advertise the series or anything, but I do recommend that folks give it a shot. Especially get past that first season, and I think you'll enjoy the second season.
Well, maybe we will cover it one day on our show.
I mean, there are worse shows out there to cover. I would certainly consider it. Until the next episode, Drea, tell us where they can find you.
The best way to find me is on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc, also on Instagram, Arkham Asylum Doc, and I'm still on LinkedIn, Andrea Letamendi.
Excellent. You can find me. I am on Twitter as bward028. You can find me on Instagram, b_ward028. Come find us on Facebook. Come find us on Twitter at Arkham Sessions, Instagram at Arkham Sessions, and be sure to follow our family over at Fanbase Press. They've got a lot of cool comics and a lot of great news over at their website, and and a lot of other great podcasts. So go pay them a visit and let them know we sent you. Until next time, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.
And there they go, our four lovable losers banding together to become the superhero fighting force no one saw coming except everybody. But fear not, there's a way out of this dreck. Follow me.